Hello students. In continuation to second generation romantic poetry, we have discussed the life and works of George Gordon Byron, and the next important poet of this generation is PB Shelley. He was a prominent English romantic poet and one of the most highly regarded and influential poets of 19th century. Shelley is one of the epic poets of 19th century and is best known for his classic anthology verse works such as Ode to the West Wind and The Mask of Anarchy. The tragedy of Shelley is that when he was alive he did not achieve fame, but when he died his fame grew. Shelley was a key member of a close circle of visionary poets and writers that included Byron, Keats, Thomas Peacock, and Mary Shelley, his second wife, who is the author of Frankenstein. Shelley, a controversial English writer of great personal conviction, was born on 4th August 1792. He was born and raised in the English countryside in the village Broadbridge Heath, just outside of West Sussex. He learned to fish and hunt in the meadows surrounding his home, often surveying the rivers and fields with his cousin and good friend Thomas Medwin. His parents were Timothy Shelley, a squire and member of Parliament, and Elizabeth Pelfold. The oldest of their 7 children, Shelley left home at the age of 10 to study at Sion House Academy, about 50 miles north of Broadbridge Heath and 10 miles west of central London. After 2 years, he enrolled at Eton College. While there, he was severely bullied, both physically and mentally, by his classmates. Shelley retreated into his imagination. Within a year's time, he had published 2 novels and 2 volumes of poetry, including Irvine and posthumous fragments of Margaret Nicholson. The earlier works of Shelley. He began writing poetry while at Eton, but his first publication was a Gothic novel, Jastrozi, in which he voiced his own heretical and atheistic opinions through the villain Jastrozi. In the fall of 1810, Shelley entered University College, Oxford. It seemed a better academic environment for him than Eton, but after a few months, a dean demanded that Shelley visit his office. Shelley and his friend Thomas Jefferson Hogg had co-authored a pamphlet titled The Necessity of Atheism. Its premise shocked and appalled the faculty, and the university demanded that both boys either acknowledge or deny authorship. Shelley did neither and was expelled. Shelley's parents were so exasperated by their son's actions that they demanded he forsake his belief, including vegetarianism, political radicalism, and sexual freedom. In August 1811, Shelley eloped with Harriet Westbrook. And both of them went to Scotland, and 1 year later went with her and her older sister to Dublin, then to Devon and North Wales, where they stayed for 6 months into 1813. They married and had 2 children. His love for her was centered on the hope that he could save her from committing suicide. They eloped, and later he became interested in a woman named Elizabeth Hitchener, a school teacher who inspired his first major poem, Queen Mab. In addition to long form poetry, Shelley also began writing political pamphlets, which he distributed by way of hot air balloons, glass bottles, and paper boats. In 1812, he met his hero and future mentor, the radical political philosopher William Godwin, who was author of Political Justice, and he married his daughter Mary and settled in Italy, the land he loved. Shelley was a dedicated vegetarian. He authored several works on the diet and spiritual practice, including A Vindication of Natural Diet. Shelley wrote Alastor, The Spirit of Solitude, 720-line poem, now recognized as his first great work. The same year, Shelley's grandfather passed away and left him an annual allowance of 1,000 British pounds. In 1816, Mary's stepsister Claire Claremont invited Shelley and Mary to join her on a trip to Switzerland. She began dating the romantic poet Lord Byron and wished to show him off to her sister. By the time they commenced the trip, Byron was less interested in Claremont. Nevertheless, the three stayed in Switzerland all summer. Shelley rented a house on Lake Geneva close to Byron's, and two men became fast friends. Shelley wrote incessantly during his visit. After a long day of boating with Byron, Shelley returned home and wrote Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. After a trip through the France Alps with Byron, he has inspired to write Mont Blanc, a pondering on the relationship between man and nature. Shortly after the publication of Revolt of Islam, Shelley, Mary, and Claremont left for Italy. Byron was living in Venice, and for the next several years, Shelley and Mary moved from city to city. While in Venice, their baby daughter Clara Everina died. A year later, their son William also passed away. Around this time, Shelley wrote Prometheus Unbound. During their residency in Livorno in 1819, he wrote The Cenci and The Mask of Anarchy and Men of England, a response to the Peterloo massacre in England. On July 8, 1822, just shy of turning 30, Shelley drowned while sailing his schooner back from Livorno to Lerici after having met with Hunt to discuss their newly printed journal, The Liberal. Despite conflicting evidence, most papers reported Shelley's death as an accident. However, based on the scene that was discovered on the boat's deck, others speculated that he might have been murdered by an enemy who detested his political belief. Shelley was cremated on the beach where his body had washed ashore. Mary, as was the custom for women during the time, did not attend her husband's funeral. Shelley's ashes were interred in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. More than a century later, he was memorized in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. The important works of Shelley include Queen Mab, The Revolt of Islam, Ode to the West Wind, To a Skylark, The Cenci, Prometheus Unbound, Adonius, Episcydian, Defense of Poetry. It is an essay where he says that poets are the true acknowledgement of the world. And Shelley is known for his optimistic view of life, and that is why we often quote that Shelley in his poem Ode to the West Wind, where he says, "If winter comes, can spring be far away?" Adonius is an elegy written on the death of another romantic poet, John Keats. In the critical essay A Defense of Poetry, it is the most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of awakening of great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution, and that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Shelley saw himself at once as poet and prophet, as the fine Ode to the West Wind makes clear. Despite his grasp of political practices, however, it is a mistake to look for concreteness in his poetry, where his concern is with subtleties of perception and with the underlying forces of nature. His most characteristic images are of sky and weather, of lights and fires. His poetic stance invites reader to respond with a similar outgoing aspiration. Thus, both Byron and Shelley in the period of conservative early 19th century English society held high regard for propriety, tradition, decorum, conventions, and institutionalized religion. They both aristocrats, well educated, left England under pressure to see themselves as outcast. Byron popular, while Shelley misunderstood. Both poets had tragically short lives, but their fame grew and influenced many writers across the world. Their poems are oft quoted, and in many anthologies of English poetry, we find at least one or the two poems of these writers. With this, I'll conclude my lecture on romantic poetry and the works of Byron and Shelley.